Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Margaret Leoy, and I'm the CEO of Chamber Music America, and this session is Holding Ourselves Accountable. The session description says that I am the facilitator, but that's really not true. We really are doing it together. This is Justin Lang from Colombo. And we're going to talk about Chamber Music America's journey with our equity initiative, which we started a few years ago, but which has come to fruition. We want to leave plenty of time for questions. I've noticed in other sessions that I've attended, there has not been enough time for questions. So we're going to kind of give you a foundation and then hope to hear from you. As you know, you can enter questions at any time at slido.com, and we'll get to those afterwards. You can also, when we finish, if you want to ask your question in person, there's a microphone there. Okay, this is who we are, you know that. So I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. Chamber Music America, as you may know, we are a service organization for the chamber music profession. And the chamber music profession includes independent musicians, ensembles, concert presenters, educators, composers, people who love chamber music, instrument makers. It's a wide gamut. And I came to Chamber Music America 17 years ago from a place called the Public Theater in New York City, which is a very diverse, racially and every way theater, and it's known for Shakespeare in Central Park. Its founder was Joseph Papp, who believed that everybody should have access to great plays, and so that's how he created his theater. And when I worked there, I worked for a writer and a producer named George C. Wolfe, who is African American. And long before the word became popular, George Wolfe called the Public Theater the theater of inclusion. And he wanted all different stories and all different people to be represented. So when I came, I was there for 7 years working with him, and he's an extraordinary person. And when I came to Chamber Music America, I came with that feeling of, we can't be so exclusionary. And classical music often has that connotation, even though it may not be that way, but people think it is that way. But in terms of diversity, Chamber Music America itself was really on the low end of that, because to us, diversity meant having a trumpet player on the board. We had no brass on the board. We had no percussion on the board. And so, diversity means many things, and that also had to be attended to. But time passed, and it became clear to me as the leader of the organization that the field itself was changing, and it was changing because the demographics of the country was changing, because musicians were traveling extensively, and the globe was changing, and people were having many different kinds of influences in their music and in their ensembles. Excuse me. But Chamber Music America was not reflecting that. Most of our membership was white, and most people, at least from my perspective, were playing Western classical music. So it took a long time to kind of infiltrate that, and to explain to our board and even to the membership that the world around them was changing. And so you see on our slide, basically in 2013 and 14, we had a strategic planning process. And in the strategic planning process, I had introduced the idea that we should be talking about diversity. What were we going to do about diversity in our plan? And the board leadership at the time felt that Chamber Music America was already diverse. You know, the musicians were diverse, we were very diverse. If you're diverse, you don't have to talk about being diverse, you just are diverse. And, you know, this, I think, sometimes is something that white people say because we all, you know, feel like we are very inclusive and not racists and don't want to be perceived as racist. So the board at the time felt if we talk about this, this is sort of showing that, you know, we're not diverse. So time passed. And we had a new board chair, which was a tremendous thing. And we had applied for a grant from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation that funds jazz because we had a big jazz program. And as part of the grant, they did an evaluation of us. And one of the things that they said was, you have the strategic plan, and there's one word we mentioned. I finally got diversity, I think, on the last page of the plan. But there was no plan about it. And they said, you know, this is kind of shocking, and you really need to think about this. So more time passed as I thought about what am I going to do about this, you know. And I think sometimes this is also an issue that leaders of organizations who are white face, like, oh, you know, how am I going to talk to my board? Our board had people of color on it, not many, but some. And I thought, you know, maybe this is something that they should bring up. Maybe, you know, how I shouldn't be talking about this. And one of my staff, who's a great person in his 70s, who has a lot of experience in the civil rights movement, basically said to me, do your job. You know, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Just do it. So I'd been coming to Sphinx for as long as Sphinx has had a conference. And at one of the sessions, I had met a woman who now works for the Duke Foundation, but I had asked her, you know, would you come and help us talk about this at the board? I had introduced it at the board level, and they seemed receptive. And she said, well, I can't do it, but I know this other person who can help you, and that person was Justin. So I want to breeze through because I'm taking too long, but you can see we started in June of 2016. Justin came to a board meeting. In the summer, we worked on a document. We reviewed it with the board. We allowed the board to actually have comments on it. And then in January of 17, the board approved the statement. So what has happened since then? In March of 17, we made a public announcement and, you know, got some feedback from them. But we have specific indicators in the statement of, so it's a well-written, beautiful philosophical statement, but working with Justin, he pointed out to us that a philosophical statement isn't going to get us where we need to go. So we articulated specific indicators that we would try to meet in 2017. And I'll get to that in a moment, but the indicators covered all aspects of our operations. So we have showcasing at our conference. So we had a showcasing goal. We had a grant-making goal. We had a conference session goal. We had a board goal. And so currently, or last October, we started rewriting guidelines for our 2018 grants, and we're revising our language, how we describe ourselves. One of the things that we said we were going to do was have 50% of our board be Alana. And those of you who may not know, Alana is African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American. And we actually have met that goal in December of 17. We had our board elections. And then this past January, we approved indicators for 2018. So these were our goals. We wanted 50% Alana board membership. So I think the actuals got a little disengaged, but we met the 50% board membership. We wanted to increase conference registrants by 50%. We did that. We wanted to increase the diversity of our membership by 50. We did that. We wanted 6 Alana showcasing ensembles, and we had 7. We wanted 15 Alana grantees, and we had 18. We wanted 20% of our communications to pertain to our equity goals. We had over 50% in our magazine, on our social media, and on our website. And we wanted to increase the number of Alana conference speakers and panelists. We didn't meet that goal because we had fewer sessions in 2018 than we had in 2017. So that's something that we're reinvigorating for next year. So Justin, you want to?
Sure.
You have your.
How's everybody doing? All right? Okay. Let's hit this forward. So what I want to talk about is just a little bit of the process that I kind of facilitated with Chamber Music America. As Margaret said, I think she started talking to me in March of 2016. And originally, at the time I was working at the Heinz Endowments, a word about Helumbo. It's a small company in Pittsburgh. And I do a variety of work with foundations or organizations around planning, a lot of it about money and planning. And this is, to me, a piece of that. I think there's a big, kind of like resource negotiation that's going on in the arts community right now about like, how are we going to deal with these resources? They were, we've got 100 people negotiating for them, and I do a bunch of work kind of at that intersection. So, and when Margaret first called me, I was working at the Heinz Endowments at the time, and I was like, I don't really like that work. I don't really want to do that work, because diversity, inclusion, and equity for me has always been kind of like this blah thing. It's like a way to like say something, but really, what does it really accomplish? But as I started to talk to her, I got a little more interested in it, and really with the idea of the equity part, and starting at the very end, and like if we could agree to some specific changes, that would be interesting to me. Because then I would know we'd be starting at the outset, like here is the power and resources that are going to move. And we're clear about that. Then we can talk about diversity and inclusion as strategies to that end. But rather than going the way it usually goes with, let's start with diversity, let's start with inclusion and equity, somewhere comes out, like it'll come out in the wash, which is just like, it doesn't happen. There's so many research data out there right now. There's a new report out in the foundation world I come from called Not Just Money, which shows it doesn't really work. If you look at the work in civil rights and education, it doesn't look good there for 50 years. This diversity piece, without an agreement about where you're going at the front end, and that being negotiated, is not going to get us where we can even be proud of. So here are the things that I just wanted to say. If you look at the outcomes that Margaret showed, there's some elements to it that I think if you're organizing something that are worth paying attention to. But I wanted to give just one shout out to the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which I really recommend as an anti-racist training group. And their point is that these are organizing issues, actually. These aren't really about persuasion. This is about organizing and power. And so you have to see it that way. And if you're trying to make some change, you've got to do a bunch of things that are around organizing, not around simply persuading. So these are the elements of the organizing work. So Margaret mentioned the philanthropic influence. I think clearly, the foundation's making a comment is important. There's some downsides to that. I think hopefully we'll talk about it in the back and forth. I'm not going to go through all these because you can read them, but I think one thing I would say is that of the list of the people components, these are different roles people can play, right? So I think hopefully you can infer, and then you can ask a question if you can't. The organizational authority is the board chair. Like, is that board chair going to ride, when it really comes time to really push? And so for me, that's an important thing to assess in your process. I think you've got to have a few people on that board. This is the kind of the assessment thing. Like, do I have the players in place to win, right? And if I don't, then I need to put the players in place, and to really be intentional about that. It might take me a year to do it, but it's kind of that, get the right people on the bus kind of thing. And I do think also the resistance. Actually having somebody who, typically white, straight male, who is always confused and has questions, that's actually helpful, right? Because they can be the person that helps the other group realize we're going to have to be organized here, right? Because they're going to pull down narratives that will stultify, are we talking about quality? Because I really care about quality, right? Well, who doesn't care about quality? And you go oh, snap, we didn't think about quality. So that I think that's useful to be prepared for that. But when it arises, to move forward, to move closer to it, to engage it, not to be run for the hills and start figuring out how you're going to protect yourself, right? Because it's going to be a battle. Because this is a battle over resources. Slavery, colonialization, there's lots of battle. That's what this is. It's a battle over resources. It's not just people don't get it. On the other side of this, I think this is what I mentioned, starting collectively with goals and being clear about that. Then you can work back on the strategies, but then the group can see, what are we actually willing to do here? And I think the group can have a moment of we're not talking about that much, or we really are talking about that much, but making it plain makes the resource battle that I think it is clear, and I think that's useful. I think structure the time. We're going to do this for 6 months, and then and what we designed was there's going to be a vote on the plan. So it's we're not just opening an open-ended process. We have a beginning, we have an end, and at the end of this process, there's going to be a decision that we're going to make. And everybody has to sign on to that in the very beginning. I actually would say that I said I would come and do the first session, and I did it. And then I was okay, y'all are good, And they were they called me back a few months later, we could use a little more help. So then we came back and then really kind of structured from an October to January. And so we did this from June to January. And again, I think the coalition building and the learning, what we did was we worked on this statement of commitment that had specific outcomes, made it a Google document, let the whole board weigh in on it. And I kind of used it, I've done some work with community benefit agreements and things where, where a whole community has to decide what they want out of a situation. I think the organizing world is a much more useful place to borrow from than the diversity, inclusion, and equity world. And so we had this Google Doc, we had agreements, people had a 30-day comment period, used it like any other kind of hearing, place. People weighed in, and then they missed the deadline, and then all of a sudden they started flurrying, oh, the board meeting's coming up, and they started adding comments and so on and so forth. But it was a really good process. I think we really, and underneath it, Margaret was doing the technical facilitation of moving this thing through, because you got to hit deadlines, you got to meet things in order to kind of keep the train going. And then we had this vote, and it was really interesting. It came up, and what was I always told the story at the last board meeting. What was so interesting was that there had been 6 months of conversation, so on and so forth, and just before we're about to go to vote, someone says, white straight woman, says, couldn't we hold off until June? We should think about this some more, right? The delay thing. And I think what we had agreed about, this goes back to the authority, organizational authority. We prepared for that. The board chair was we're voting today. We can vote it down, but then we have to be the ones who remember that. We voted it down, right? We did this. No one did it to us. We couldn't figure out how to get it done. We decided to make a decision not to do it. And so then he was that's it. discussion over, and we're going to call for the vote. And it was like unanimous, right? And then it went forward, and then you see the real actual resources that were distributed over the course of a year. So I just think it was something that, the organization, the key piece that I would say is the organization agreed to make a commitment to do something. You can't facilitate unless power agrees to make a move. And that's why I think it's useful to get that out front, because if you're the person who's trying to move this through, if authority is not going to agree to make a change, they're just going to have you kind of like do the dance, right? And so I think for me, that's why it was useful for me to talk with Margaret, and then they agreed. So that was an agreement that there was going to be a change, and then something can be done. But the real issue is the people with power who make decisions. It has to be, I think, skillfully facilitated, but it's not about skillful facilitation. It's not about that, because people could give away all the resources tomorrow if they wanted to. They could sign away their charters and just hand it over to people and say, I couldn't do it, here you have it. It's not an issue of facilitation. It's not an issue of persuasion. It's an issue of power. People have to be willing to share it. So, my 2 cents.
No, that's a lot more than 2 cents, right? We honestly could not have done it without Justin or someone like Justin, but there's no one like Justin. So, because you can't do this kind of work alone, particularly if you are rooted in a certain culture. It's just difficult. Strategic planning is difficult to do by yourself because you don't see outside of what you're already doing. And there were a lot of things in my first conversation with Justin that I was talking about, and Justin started our conversation by saying, let me tell you what I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in, coming and making a lot of people feel good about talking about diversity. I'm interested in making a change. And I was interested in making a change. I just needed help. We, the organization, needed help in how to do it and how to talk about it and how to be effective. So we want to leave a lot of time for questions, and we have about 30 minutes. And we can, if you don't have any questions, we can certainly talk more, but are there any? Thank you. And also, someone was going to look on Slido for us. So.
Yeah, do we record this to get the slide?
No, she has the thing, but please.
Good morning. My name is Anna Kuwabara. I'm at the Albany Symphony.
Oh, great.
And my question for you, I understand it's about organization, not persuasion, but I was interested, Margaret, how did you get to the point of having the board on board to bring Justin to, because there had to be some, how did you get, is it on? Yes? Yes, now it's on. How did you get to the point of persuading the board to bring Justin on board? Because you must have had talking points that were helpful to get to that point. I feel like I have a very open and fertile board, but it is about resources and what makes it worth the time and the money to pursue this. So
As I mentioned, when I first came in 2000, we had a certain, our board was primarily white, it was primarily male, and we were very interested in, at the time, diversity of instrumentation and geography, because we're a national organization. So our board reflected that. And after a few years, I realized we have a binary board structure. So 21 of our board members must come from the field of chamber music. That's in our bylaws. And we may have up to 15 other board members who can be from the field but don't have to be from the field. And those are people who are more traditional board members. They have perhaps more financial resources than our chamber music board members do. But all board members have 3-year terms, so there's a lot of rotation. And I realized that, and this was long before even 2013 and 14, that our board needed to have racial and gender diversity. So every time we had a nominating committee meeting in preparation for the next round of rotation, I would try to encourage the committee members to identify people that were not white men who played Western European classical music, because as we've said in many other sessions here, there's not, there are many wonderful people who do that, but it's not the entire story. And if we are a national organization that says we include all styles of chamber music, then we need those styles and those people represented. And that took a long time. It took a long time. I mean, I've been there 17 years, and probably maybe about 4 years ago, I saw this I see now, this is really starting to happen. And so when we got a new board chair, which was about 3 years ago, he was very, very much on board with this idea of making the organization more equitable in all of its work. So he was the one, I went to him and said, this is really important to me, and it should be important to the organization, and I would like to talk to the board at one of the meetings about this. And he was 100% on board. If he had not been, we would not be this far. I would not have given up, but we would not be this far. So, so he was a primary factor, and the composition of the board at that time in 2016 was a primary factor, because we had we didn't have a lot of Alana members on our board, but we had enough so that when I brought the topic up of, particularly in our grant making, that 75% of all of our grants were going to white people. And, that was alarming, and we needed to change that. And when I presented data, that was very striking to people, and particularly the people of color on the board were very happy that I had brought it up. And someone said, I don't always want to be the person on the board that has to be talking about race. I mean, I'm a musician, and I want to talk about music, and this is not the only reason why I want to join boards. So that was, it just took a long time, and it was an arduous process to get enough people together who I felt were like-minded.
Can I just add to that too? That in the first meeting, I asked Margaret if she could get the data to show this information, and she did this painstaking. I did the same thing when I worked at the Heinz Endowments, because the data didn't record it this way, and Margaret did this incredibly painstaking work of going through and coding it and deciding to be able to show some data. So the second piece I would say is, in this list over here, I should have had data, data should have been there. But then going back to the philanthropic influence, because the kickover was when Doris Duke said this is an issue. So I do think it's important. There's persuasion, but it's the power is important. So when she's getting the board on there differently, and then you have Doris Duke on there, and then you have data, you're organizing power. So while I do think they're not persuaded that, I think, as though they haven't been alive their whole life to hear these arguments, they're persuaded that the power is changing. I think that's what the persuasion you have to do. You have to be able to persuade that this is not in your favor, the side that you're on.
Hi, I'm Taylor Lockwood from the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. So you guys are doing really excellent work, but a lot of us have traditionally white boards, our orchestras. How do you incite change within your traditionally white boards to care about issues of race, LGBTQIA rights, transgender rights, and just making also music of not traditionally white people are getting them to be on board with programming that kind of music so that you can get people besides 65 and older white men to sit in your audience?
You can try and have an idea, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I think, I find this among our presenter members. Everybody is interested in having an audience, and the composition of people's communities is changing. And if you want to have an audience, it cannot continue to just be one type of person. So, in New York City, and I would think Los Angeles would have a similar initiative, might not be the right word, but concurrent with everything that was going on with us in 2016, the city of New York had a new cultural department commissioner, and he sent out a questionnaire to every organization that got funding from the city, and you had to fill it out. Because if you didn't fill it out, you wouldn't get your funding. So you had to fill it out of how many board members you had, how many white board members you had, how many staff you had, how many white staff members you had, what was the composition of your audience. There were an awful lot of questions. New York City's population is 56% people of color. And the data showed that something like 95% of boards were white. Well, clearly this doesn't reflect the population that the organizations are supposed to be serving as nonprofit organizations. So I would say if, and it's a long process. You're not going to have one meeting with your board and they're going to say, great, here's the checkbook, do whatever you need to do. But I do think that presenting data that has to do with who you are reaching as an arts organization and as a nonprofit organization that has a responsibility to the community, I think that certainly would be a beginning. And I would also suggest, I don't know if you heard Bob Lynch in one of the sessions yesterday said he was talking about fundraising, and he said, and interestingly, nobody on my board had ever met another human being. And I think that way about people of color. There are white people who do know people of color. They just don't think of them when you're talking about, who we're collecting names for the next round of nominations. And I say this to our board members, think of people that may not be in your immediate circle. If you don't know anybody, maybe ask somebody who might know somebody. And so I would encourage you to talk to board members that you believe think the way you do, and ask them to explore their networks and see who you may be able to bring into your closer family to get this work done. Do you want to add
No, I'm
to
good.
that? Okay.
Hello, I'm Janelle Robinson with Art Ops in Southfield, Michigan. And I just want to say that I really appreciate your honesty, coming from a background of conflict resolution, just seeing your strategy of going from the end result and then dividing the process. So the question I have for you is just wondering, and you have tapped on a little bit, if you can expound on your personal anxieties of one being the white person that has to address racial issues in your board, and then being the black person that has to come in and tell white people about racism. Jesus, so is there, because I think people aren't honest about these things, because like you said, the person that's on your board, they're there because they're, whatever your cause is, right? They don't always want to have to be the representative of all black people or all whoever people, at this time. So I just wondered if you can expound on your personal feelings so that we can just kind of hear that part.
There's not enough time in this session to talk about my personal anxieties, that I can tell you. You know, I mean, Justin and I have talked to Justin about my personal anxieties, and he has said, I think, you know, the work that you are doing, or what he has been preparing me to do, is to lead the organization in this way, because he, you know, he's not in my pocket every time I need a good answer. I have to be prepared, you know, to deal with issues that come up. And I'm anxious about I'm anxious about everything, but I'm anxious about this a lot because I don't want to take a misstep on behalf of the organization. I don't want Chamber Music America to look like we are not genuine, or that we don't have integrity, or that we don't care, or that we're dumb. You know, I want us to look. I want us to look the way we feel, and so I'm anxious that I'm going to write something that will, you know, be public, that won't express something exactly right. This kind of work, it's so sensitive that you know, race is very sensitive. I mean, one thing that we have instituted on our staff is to be race explicit when we are talking about race. So, you know, we have to say the word race when we're talking about it. And because people talk around it because they don't feel comfortable with it. And 60% of my staff now are people of color. And so it's not just the white people that don't feel comfortable. You know, there's a whole feeling among some of my African American staff of, you know, the emotional labor that, you know, everybody is coming up to them saying like, well, I don't know, you know, is this okay to say, and that, and you know, that's a burden for them too. So we try to alleviate some of that at staff meetings, and you know, if you're gonna bungle something, bungle it at home, right? And then we can sort of help each other. We're also getting training as much as we can. We're not doing it as an entire staff, but we're doing it, you know, whoever is available, or whatever funding we have, we can send 2 people to this thing and 1 person to that thing. So, do you want to talk about your anxieties?
Sure. You know, because this is like my work now, I don't have a lot of anxiety about it now, you know, because it's what I do. So I have general work anxiety about getting and facilitating. Will I do a good job facilitating and this kind of thing? And also, I think I have kind of an internal narrative of justification. I think this is what should be done. I don't feel that bad about that. So when I was in a predominantly white organization, I did feel that heat sometimes about raising these issues and so on and so forth. But for some reason, I just think I'm a little tone deaf. So I think that's what I would say about I didn't give her enough anxiety, actually. I have more. No, I know, I see you. I see you. I see the water. I'm just joking. I have the mic. But I do think that it's, I would say, so for right now, I don't see it that much. And when I was in an organization, honestly, it wasn't a huge part of it for me. I think it was something that I felt was justified. I'd have to think about it more, but it honestly wasn't a big thing.
I have a question from Slido, and it says, what are you doing now externally to change the field when distribution of the most coveted classical music opportunities still mostly go to white artists?
An excellent question. So we have a classical commissioning program. It started in 1983, and up until 2017, we had made 205 grants 140 of which had gone to white male composers. And we had tried over the years to tell ensembles, because in our program the ensemble applies, or a presenter applies with an ensemble. A composer does not apply directly to us. So the ensemble has to come with a composer. And we would say, you know, there are a lot of wonderful women composers, there are a lot of wonderful African-American composers, and they come with white composers because, again, that's who they know. They want to get the grant, so they come with the person that they feel is going to give them the best opportunity. So what we have recently done, we've started a database, and we're calling it the Composer Equity Project. So this is particularly for women and people of color. And we've sent emails to composers that we know to say, if you want to be part of this, please fill this out and we'll include you in this database. And we've also publicly stated, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funds our classical commissioning program, and we went to them and said, we want to change this. We want to correct this imbalance. And they were 100% on board with it. So we have said in our classical commissioning guidelines that are on our website, chamber-music.org, that we intend to make the majority of grants to ensembles who apply with women and composers of color. Now, when we issued our, when we made our statement of commitment public in March of 2017, we asked for member feedback, and most of the feedback was very positive, but there was one member who wrote, if you are going to make grants based on race, I am not going to renew my membership. And, you know, it took my breath away, speaking of anxiety, and I understood that the person was feeling like, okay, I'm already marginalized as a musician, and now you're increasing that or decreasing. You're making me more marginalized. But interestingly, because we just had a round of grants in 2017, we did a lot of work diversifying the applicant pool. So the applicant pool generally was 25% people of color. Now, this past year, it was 35%. It's not huge, but it's better than nothing. And we always use blind listening, which is listening without knowing who you're listening to. So our panels listen blindly. And just because the applicant pool was bigger, had more people of color, that's how we made more grants. So it had nothing to do, nobody is you know, cherry picking, all the people of color are getting grants and nobody else is getting grants. It just works out that people who are good musicians, who are people of color, if they apply, they're going to be in the mix. So, yeah, that's...
Just two things real quickly. I think to this notion of a broader, bigger issues, that the board had an interesting conversation this past January to say, like, we can continue to do these kind of technical improvements. What are some bigger issues that we could weigh in on? They had a conversation about that. Where that could go, I think, is going to be interesting. The second thing I was going to say was I wanted to mention this part we didn't discuss, which is that we used a racial equity lens for this work, so that it was about LGBTQ, people with disabilities, women, but through the lens of a lot of people. And I think that's a false distinction that we should really push back on in this work, to say it's not about like women and people of color, because that erases all women of color, right? It's not about LGBTQ and people of color. That erases all LGBTQ people of color. And we really need to see that as an aggression against those groups of people, because people of color are not straight men. And that's an erasure of that group. It's not, and what it really is also is it's a window for those white communities. And so my whole thing is, I'm working with another group right now, and it's really a struggle. Name the white people you want to help. Name them. I'm not mad at you, but if you want to help white rural people, name them, because we should not be the only ones who get racialized as long as we're in this racializing experience.
Hi, Jennifer Bowman. I work with the Kennedy Center, but I previously worked with 2 early music ensembles who are members of Chamber Music America, so it's wonderful to hear all this. You've answered part of my question about the increase of pool for grant applications and where they were coming from, but I'm just curious on how your marketing and outreach had to change in order to find those people in the first place.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. If you didn't hear it, the question was, how did our marketing change to reach composers of people, applicants of color? You know, sometimes because staff has a lot of things to do, a lot of work is done electronically. My staff is very big on, I sent an email, you know, and because I'm a different generation, I'm very big on speaking to people and talking on the telephone. So I encouraged our program officers to actually call people. Don't just send an email. I mean, they do both because they do both. But we did a lot of grassroots contacting. First of all, we contacted previous grantees of color and said, this is an initiative, this is really important to us, and we have a deadline coming up. Can you please activate your networks of colleagues and let them know about the deadline? And so that worked. We called other associations, you know, associations of black composers or women. There's women, for our jazz program, there's, I think, Women in Jazz in the South or something like that. And, you know, we called organizations and said, this is what we're doing. Can you get the word out? And even in terms of listing our available positions on our staff. You know, that's something that a lot of my colleague organizations, you know, everyone wants a diverse staff, but where are you advertising? How are you writing the job description? What qualifications are you requesting that are really not necessary, but you've just always requested them? And primarily, where are you posting? So we're, you know, we can always improve, but that's basically how we got the 10% bump in our grant applicants, was just by doing the grassroots contacting people.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I guess I want to acknowledge a couple of things. I'd like to acknowledge you for this work, because I think of chamber music definitely as kind of a bastion of white supremacy. I mean, when we think about the audience typically and all the wealth and power that tends to collect around specifically chamber music, I appreciate that. And I want to say for the white people in the room, it's a lot of work. So I think that, well, for all of us in the room, it's a lot of work. And so I think that piece about who's supposed to lead it, white people need to lead it, because it's a hell of a lot of work. I think about all the things you're listing and all the things you're not listing. It's so much work, and it's not up to people of color to lead it, because they've been the recipients of it for so long, you know. And I love what you said about, you know, it's really about the shifting of power and resources. So thank you for saying that. And I wanted to ask you, Harvard Business Review just came out with a report in which they said that diversity training is kind of backfiring, basically. That is creating groups of people who have a certain increased aggression toward people of color in their workplaces. And I wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah.
And I guess my other question is about everybody knows diversity and inclusion and equity are the things we're supposed to be working toward, and a lot of white people know that. So we've learned to speak like it matters.
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean our behavior has changed. So if you could speak to those two things, that'd be
That's great. I appreciate that. You know, Dr. King spoke about this backlash, right, in 66, 67, right? And people were blaming Dr. King and the movement for this backlash, just like they blame Barack Obama in some ways for Donald Trump. I think that we should blame and name is white fragility. That's what we need to understand, right? So it's absolutely, it's real. It's in the room all the time. Because whiteness is not a real construction, so it knows it's so fragile, any examination of it, it will fall apart. So I think what we should know is we have to have a deeper analysis. So absolutely, when you discuss diversity, inclusion, and equity, the white fragility that's in the room will rear its head. But it's the white fragility causing the reaction, and we have to be prepared and organized for that issue. So that's what I would say about that. The second thing, because as long as white fragility is not threatened, it's not bothering anybody. It's like, I'm cool, I'm straight. So that's what's causing it. The second thing I'd say is, I totally agree with you about this diversity, inclusion, and equity issue of the language and what it could cause a problem. That to me is a bigger threat. Are there any Soprano fans here? No, it's an old show, a couple people maybe. So The Sopranos, no, the HBO, not the Sopranos, the singers. That's not my, I forgot my audience. I think so little about that kind of thing, I don't even realize what I'm saying. Sorry. But in the case of, in The Sopranos, there's this one piece where Tony, the sociopathic mafia killer, etc., he's in psychotherapy, and there's his therapist has a colleague who's jealous of her relationship with Tony, and is always trying to caution her about his therapy. He eventually says, there's some research to show that psychotherapy for sociopaths only makes them more effective sociopaths. They learn how to hide and disguise themselves. I do think this is an issue for racism. And I do think it's an issue for white people that we are training a lot of white people on all of the language, right? I think the only way around that really is power. I don't think it's a issue of, so I think we have to keep that at the forefront. I absolutely think, I see it, I've seen it in organizations, the language gets absorbed. It really is happening. Yep.
It says time is up, so I think probably time is up. Yeah, what? Oh. Okay, one more question's great.
So this kind of actually leads up pretty well. It says, if the board or other staff were resistant to this conversation, how did you get them on board to help in crafting the goals and working to make them happen?
Have I gotten them on board? I'm not sure. Well, they all voted yes, so that was something. I think actually the board, a lot of the board getting in sync with this is the job of the board chair. It's mine too, but it's a lot his. I think much more about the staff. Because I didn't think about the staff when we first started this. Not that I didn't think about them, they were involved in making the indicators, and we talked about it a lot. What I didn't think of was, how are they going to implement it? And have we, Chamber Music America, given them the right tools to be able to do their job? So that is something that by giving them some training and by, as I said, talking about it at every staff meeting, I think we are, bringing people on board. I did have a situation where I did have to speak to one staff person because I felt there was, she was not articulating our initiative correctly to the outside world, or correctly, maybe not the way I wanted it. I thought it should be articulated. And so, that's one of those tough conversations that a supervisor has to have with a staff person. So that's what I did.
And I'll just add one thing to the process. We put together a committee at the very beginning of like 5 or 6 people that was going to be the group that would do the thinking in between meetings. That group held the agenda, and then when it came time to actually vote on it, that group was there in the room and had weight. So I absolutely think, and I think sometimes just from a, again, this comes from just general community organizing thing, is to take advantage of the existing structures and to try to move those for what you want to do. So if there's an executive committee that you think is to make that committee also the committee that looks at these questions. So you don't have to create another issue. And that group then, I think, played this role of leadership. So I do think, again, it's about the technical pieces, and that executive committee I thought was helpful. We drafted it, gave them a first look at it, they weighed in, but we did have a group of people that we were building who had who held this more strongly. And now at the last meeting, you could really see a couple of them in the room who've really shifted. When they first came, there were some ambivalence about, even from people of color, about, do I want to be in this role? And now they're clearly there, and they're a force on the board.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and weekend.